Hello and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to share 3 things that I think every knitter needs to know. If you're new here, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website yarnaddict.co.uk. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. So I thought I would share 3 things that I think every knitter needs to know. I think what you learn when you learn to knit depends on the age you are and how you learn. I was taught to knit by my mum when I was a child, quite a young child. I don't remember learning to knit. You may have been taught by a parent, an aunt or uncle, or a grandparent. And if that was the case, if you had problems, they would probably sort out those problems for you. So they probably taught you how to knit to start with, and maybe purl, depending on how old you were. They probably cast on for you and then taught you how to knit, maybe how to purl, and then maybe later they taught you how to cast on and cast off. If as an adult a friend teaches you, or you go to a class, they probably show you how to cast on, cast off, knit and purl. I would say that's probably what I would teach in a very basic how to knit class. But quite often new knitters are taught how to cast on, cast off, knit and purl, and not much beyond that, and they're kind of left to find out the rest for themselves. So today I thought I would share some of the things that I think you need to know, and I have had some quite experienced knitters in my classes who have not been able to do some of these things, and one of them I'm actually going to demonstrate. If you're a knitter, you will always make mistakes. It's unavoidable. I make mistakes, I drop stitches. You need to learn how to fix mistakes. The problem with mistakes is that it's a very big topic. I've been asked in the past to teach workshops on fixing mistakes, but it's like one of those how long is a piece of string kind of questions, because it just depends on what mistake you make. I think all the mistakes I've made over the years, it'd be very difficult to teach a class on that. But I do have some videos on my website specifically in fixing mistakes in lace knitting. I have one on fixing mistakes in brioche knitting, I think. If I make a mistake in my knitting that I think would make a good tutorial and I'm able to film myself fixing it, I tend to just sit down at my table with the camera rolling and fix it on camera so I can turn it into a tutorial. But it depends on when I make the mistake. Sometimes it's too dark and I can't do it and I want to get on, and other times I may be out and about somewhere and I can't do it. But most of my fixing mistake tutorials have been mistakes that I've made and then fixed on camera. So I'm not going to show you how to fix specific mistakes because it's just such a wide topic. It could literally be anything. But when you make a mistake, before you just pull your needles out and unravel, try and fix it. If you're going to unravel it anyway, you might as well try and fix it. What have you got to lose? If you make a mistake and you make the mistake bigger, you can unravel if you're going to unravel anyway. And if you manage to fix it, then you've saved all that unraveling and reknitting time. You also need to be able to unravel and unpick stitches. I have some videos where I show you how to unravel stitches. It may be mainly in lace knitting, I'm not sure. I'll see what videos I can find and link them in the description below this video. But it's a good idea when you're learning to knit, or even if you're an experienced knitter and you're learning a new technique, perhaps you're learning brioche knitting, lace knitting, colourwork, whatever it is, do practice how to unpick stitches as you're learning how to, once you master the technique, then practice how to unpick stitches, because there will come a time when you've made a mistake and you need to unpick stitches. You may as well learn how to do it straight away. The biggest problem, I think, especially with new knitters, but also some experienced knitters, is when we drop stitches. You may have dropped the stitch several rows down and then you count your stitches and you notice you've got the wrong number of stitches, and you look down the fabric and you realize there's a drop stitch. I once in a sock noticed I dropped the stitch quite far down after I had cast off. So I fixed that. I will link it below if I can find that video. You may also have made a mistake. pulled the stitch when you should have knitted it or something like that, and you need to unravel down and fix it and pick it back up again. Or you may be knitting along and suddenly a stitch just jumps off your needles and unravels down, and you need to pick it back up again. So I'm going to show you how to do that now, because I think that is one of the things that new knitters fear the most, is dropping a stitch. And even experienced knitters, if you're learning new techniques, especially lace knitting and brioche knitting, it can be a bit more challenging to pick up dropped stitches. But the best thing, whether you are brand new to knitting or an experienced knitter learning a new technique, is if you're not confident picking up dropped stitches, knit a little swatch, drop some stitches, practice picking them up, because the only way you're going to get good at it is to do it. I'm going to show you now how I pick up stitches, and I'm also going to talk about a couple of things that I noticed that new knitters may need help with. So let's look at what to do when you drop a stitch. So I have two tools that I think are quite useful. You can just use your knitting needle to pick up the stitch, but it is easier to use a crochet hook. You can of course use just a regular crochet hook. I recommend using one that's a little bit smaller than what you are, the needle you're knitting with. So if you're using 4mm needles, I'd probably go for a smaller crochet hook. One that's really tiny compared to the needles you're knitting with might be more difficult to use because the hook is quite small, so getting the yarn to hook over it might be challenging. But if you're knitting with 4mm, I tend to use like say 3.5mm maybe, but whatever I've got. So I've got these two that I use a lot. This is Lantern Moon and it's 3.25mm needles. I rarely knit with anything over a 4mm needle, occasionally a 4.5 or 5mm, but it's very rare. So this is suitable for most of my knitting. If I use lace weight yarn, it's usually I knit with 3.5mm needles, so this would still be suitable. And if I knit socks, I would knit with 2.5 or 2.75mm needles. In that case, this would be a bit big. This one is from Lantern Moon, and in my shop at the moment it's £5, so you can find that in my online shop. It's ebony wood and I really like it. Knitpro do a set of 3. This one is 3.5mm, then there's one that is 4.5mm and one that's 5.5mm. So you got choice. If you use thicker yarns as well, you might want to get a pack like this. This one is £5.50, so obviously it's better value because you get 3. But as I would mainly only use the small one, I don't see the point in necessarily getting that pack. I'd probably get the Lantern Moon one because they're prettier. The other thing with the Knitpro one is that you have a hook on one end and a needle point on the other end. I must admit, I haven't really used the needle point very much yet. I mainly use the hook part of it. So let's look at picking up a stitch. So I've dropped the stitch here. We have another stitch here, which we'll come to in a minute. But I've dropped the stitch here, so I've let it unravel a few rows. Now, can you see I have all these strands here? Each one of those strands is one row. If you drop a stitch and you can't immediately pick it up, if you have these padlock stitch markers, it's really useful to put those through your stitch to stop them from unraveling any further. Alternatively, you can just get your knitting needle and poke it through the stitch, or a piece of yarn on the sewing needle and take it through the stitch. Just anything to stop it unraveling further, especially if you're close to, say, the cast on edge or a difficult pattern section, or it's a very slippery yarn, because slippery yarns unravel much quicker. Also, avoid pulling on the fabric, because if you pull on the fabric, it will unravel much quicker. So let's use this one. So what I'm going to do is use this to pick the stitch up. Now, a stitch is like an archway, and you want to make sure the archway is open. So I want to put the hook in with the hook bit pointing upwards. So we're just going to go straight in through that arch with the hook pointing upwards. If you have the hook pointing down, then when you pull the next strand through, it twists the stitch, and then you have to take the hook out and put it back in again. So if you can have the hook pointing upwards, that will make it a lot easier. And I tend to put my left index finger in there just to make it easier to separate the strands of that I'm going to pick up. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. I've unraveled this. So I go under the first strand. Now, if you're not a crocheter, you might just try and pull this straight through like that. Probably isn't going to go through. With crochet, you do have to kind of twist the hook slightly and kind of wiggle it through like that. Under the next strand and twist it and wiggle it through. Make sure you don't split the yarn. So if I have the hook pointing downwards, down towards the table, when I, one thing is, oh, hang on, it's a little bit more difficult to grab the right strand, but when I pull it through, my stitch is now twisted, so to go and do the next row I have to take it out and put it back in again. Now that's not a problem when you have the hook facing up towards the ceiling upwards. Then I can just go under the next strand, wiggle it through, under the next strand, pull it through, under the next strand and pull it through. I do quite often find when I do this that it ends up a bit looser on one side than the other. Normally that will even out. If the further down you have managed to unravel, the more likely you are to get a little bit of a kind of ladder on one side. Usually it will even out after a while as the stitch kind of moves around. Blocking will quite often help. So I wouldn't look at it and think, oh, that's going to look awful. Knit a few rows. You can already see after I pulled on that a bit, that looks perfectly fine. So let me just finish knitting this row and then I'm going to show you a couple of other things. So back here when I was knitting this, I deliberately dropped a stitch and then I carried on knitting. I've done that a few times, and then what happens is when you drop it, you can see the next couple of rows, especially the next row, there's a little bit of extra space there, but then as you go up, here, there's no extra space between these two stitches to be able to take this stitch back up. Now, if you do this and you don't notice you've dropped it, sometimes it doesn't unravel very far, especially if you have just maybe knitted through to like one of the tiny strands that make up the yarn, or if it's a yarn that's a bit kind of fussy and it kind of catches a bit. So sometimes it doesn't unravel very far and you may not notice it until you count your stitches, and then you're thinking, why have I got a stitch less? I did this in a pair of socks a few years ago. It was all in stocking stitch, and I think I dropped it like just above the heel. I was knitting toe up probably, and when I got to the rib of the top, I thought, why don't I have the right number of stitches? And I looked and I couldn't see any problems, so I thought, well, I needed an even number of stitches to do 2 by 2 ribs. I just increase the stitch to make it work, and it wasn't until afterwards I realized I dropped the stitch quite far down. So let's look at how to pick this one up. So I put it on one of these stitch markers just to stop it unraveling. So I'm actually going to unravel it a couple more rows like that. So now I'm going to use the same technique to pick it up. Let me just zoom in a bit more. Up to there, and then I'm going to go as far up as I can. Now I think I can go one more row. I think if I go another row it might, maybe I can go one more row. That next row it will start becoming quite tight, and I'm trying to force a stitch in through here. That's not going to fit. I forgot to bring a sewing needle with me, but what I would do in this situation, so I can't go any further up. Even if I haven't finished my knitting and I notice I've done this, and I think if it's in a place where it's not going to show that well, or depending on what it is, I don't want to unravel loads of rows to fix it, I might just increase a stitch to make up for it so I have the right stitch count. But what you can do is you can take a bit of spare yarn. Now, how am I going to do this? Because I don't have a sewing needle here. Okay, it'll do it this way. I'm going to just, normally you would do this with a sewing needle, but I'm going to just use the crochet hook. So if you take a yarn through this stitch and then put that yarn through a sewing needle and pull it through to the other side, I'm going to use the crochet hook. There we go. So I've now pulled that through to the wrong side of the fabric, and I will then weave in those ends to make sure that's secure. And if I look very closely, I can see that there is a stitch that kind of disappears here. But if I just glance at it, I can't necessarily see it. So it's, if you notice you've dropped the stitch much further down, as long as your stitch pattern is correct, don't worry too much about it. Just do this fix, weave it in at the back. And if I'd done like a long way, like on my socks where I'd nearly finished the sock, I would just increase the stitch and fudge it, especially on socks, because who's going to notice when it's on your feet? Another problem that I've seen a lot of knitters have, especially, I see this a lot in, there's a knitting forum, knitters forum I think it's called, I don't know if it's called knitters or knitting, on Reddit, and I see this there not every day but almost on a daily basis. And I also had a lady in one of my workshops a few years ago. I walked past this lady and I thought, oh, her sweater that she's wearing has an interesting texture. And then a bit later on, I was watching her do something and I said, do you realize you're twisting your stitches as you knit them? And she went, no. And I showed her what I meant. And she said, oh, that's why, is that why my knitting looks different from everyone else's? And I went, yes, probably. And what quite often happens, can you see here how I just did it for a few rows here. On every right side row, I knitted the knit stitches just along here through the back loop. And then I pulled them as normal. And you get this slightly kind of wonky stitch pattern. So if you get stitches that look a bit wonky like that, as opposed to that, that is because you have twisted the stitches. You may just accidentally twist one stitch, which means you knit it through the back loop. And you might be saying, well, I didn't knit it through the back loop. What I think some people do, especially people who are trying to teach themselves to knit continental style, or people who are trying to learn to knit but doing a continental style, is with continental purl, if you are not careful, you actually end up doing something called combination purl, which is a completely different style of knitting. So it's not wrong, but it means that when you purl a stitch, it ends up twisted so that when you come to knit it, it's sitting the wrong way on the needle. So you have to knit it through the back loop rather than through the front loop. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, but I might do a separate video on that another time and do a little bit of a kind of troubleshooting when it comes to learning continental knitting. So I might do that as a separate video. I do have an online course for continental knitting as well. So if you have tried to learn continental knitting, or you fancy it, but you have had problems, or you haven't been able to learn on your own, I do have an online course, which I will link below. So if you're getting these wonky stitches, which are quite common, I think, for new knitters, but I think it probably maybe happens most for continental knitters who are getting the purl stitch slightly wrong and end up with twisted stitches, because they're actually doing combination knitting, which means that your knit stitches will sit the wrong way on your needles and you have to knit them through the back loop. Let me know if you've had this problem with twisted stitches and whether you knit continental or English style. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you're a new knitter, tell me what your biggest challenge has been when it comes to learning to knit. Or if you're an experienced knitter, what do you wish you'd been taught when you learned to knit? What other things do you think the new knitters or inexperienced knitters, or knitters who are returning to knitting after a long break, what are some of the things that you think that they need to know? I may turn into video in the future. So share your comments below, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.